Next up is another one of our colleagues from Sheffield University, Dr. Kate Hamblin from the Circle Centre that Sue and Matt are also part of. So Kate, please make your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to be involved, and the great presentations we've just had as well, which, as Matt says, give a really great context to what I'm about to talk about. And what I'm going to talk about is about technology, but really I'm going to talk about people, because it's not really about the gizmos or the gadgets or the whizzy bits of kit. It's about the people that use them, the people that are connected by them, the people that make them work. And I want to talk about where we've been, where we are, and where we might go with technology and care. So in terms of where we've been, technology and care systems have always been a tool or a facilitator for what are very human caring relationships. And they've always been highly reliant on people to make them work. So if you think to the classic pendant alarm, which has been around since the 1960s, they're ubiquitous. 1.4 million people in the UK have one. They really haven't progressed technologically since they emerged in the 1960s. They're very simple mechanically. They rarely fail mechanically, but as a service, that's where things can start to go wrong from the perspective of the user. So in work we've done, we rarely heard people say that they pressed the button and it didn't send the signal to the response box. They would more likely report that where it went wrong was around the assessment or the installation or the way the call was handled or the response service. So people there are really integral to these technologies working. But yet often these people are invisible. So, for example, during the pandemic, the Technology Enabled Care Strategy Board, which is the representative body for these services, had to lobby government to make sure these people were included as key workers. So they would have access to PPE, access to childcare, because they were invisible, because the focus is so often on the technology rather than all the services around them that make them work. And policy is incredibly technocentric and device focused. And as another example of where it's focused specifically on the kit rather than what makes the kit work, if we think to Matt Hancock's promise of 10,000 iPads for care homes during the pandemic to replace what were deemed unnecessary in-person visits or dangerous in-person visits, that didn't factor in the fact that 1/3 of all care homes do not have adequate Wi-Fi. So 7,000 care homes don't have adequate Wi-Fi. And it doesn't factor in the other end of that. So with an iPad, you can do Skype calls, for example, to people who are not able to visit you anymore. But do those friends, family have the access to those similar devices, Wi-Fi, the skills to connect? It just was a very technocentric approach to an issue that was essentially social, a sort of technological sticking plaster that didn't actually adequately address the real issue. But nonetheless, technology is a key policy area. We've seen it in the recent white paper on social care. And technologies are getting smarter and are able to do more. They're able to be more predictive and preventative. And they almost need to be, actually, because we are going to see the switching off of the analog systems that a lot of the traditional telecare is reliant on. So we're going to need to move to digital. Are they going to be digital pendant alarms, or are they going to be something a little bit cleverer almost? And we've seen examples in our work of where local authorities and other organisations are exploring these more preventative and predictive pieces of equipment. So you've got, for example, the armed system, which can record people's sleep patterns and mobility patterns and use that with predictive analytics modelling to alert when they're at risk of a fall, rather than a very reactive system picking them up off the floor when they have fallen. However, again, these types of technologies still require people to use that data and information and then take action that can prevent an emergency taking place. So technologies have been deployed in adult social care to keep people safe, but they have to involve people. And they were very traditionally deployed to do this, to manage risk around aging in place. And that, to some degree, had some unintended consequences because of the way these technologies function. They are very place specific, so they don't really enable people to travel further afield than their homes. That, you know, increasingly that is possible, but pendant alarms can't really do that for you. And I think we, as a society, and also policy, wants more. If we think about the Care Act that Sue referenced, well-being is in there. We want well-being, we want a good life, we want happiness. And in our work, we've been thinking about the ways care can be organised to deliver on well-being, and included in that is the way technologies can help deliver well-being. And we think about well-being as being a multidimensional concept. So we think about how materially what people have can contribute to their well-being, and certainly some people can be excluded from the well-being effects of things like technology if they can't afford them or afford access to the connectivity to make them work well. So we've seen examples of local authorities not just providing equipment, but actually providing the connectivity that people need. So there are examples of local authorities investing in 5G mesh networks and LoRaWAN networks to provide that free Wi-Fi connectivity to people living there, to then enable them to use digital devices to support their care needs. We also think about the subjective well-being, so how people's sense of self is affected, and we certainly know that pendant alarms don't necessarily bolster a very positive sense of self. They carry a degree of stigma. They're generally not worn with pride. And perhaps the move we've seen in some local authorities towards more mainstream devices can address some of that, because these devices do carry less stigma because everybody has them, sort of thing. But the area I really want to focus on is the relational well-being, so our social relationships and how technology can contribute to those. So a colleague of ours called Annie Austin took relational well-being, so relationships, that step further to think about good social relationships and how actually that is fundamental to a good life, and that care is a fundamental part of sociality and good social relationships. And thinking about how technology can contribute to sociality and good social relationships, we've certainly in the project observed how COVID-19, though it has been undeniably terrible, it has actually accelerated the use of technology for this purpose. For example, we're here now today at a festival on Zoom. I'm sure we've all used Zoom in our personal lives in ways that perhaps we hadn't before, to quiz with family, or I've used it to attend baby music classes with my son. Something I definitely wouldn't have done prior to the pandemic. But if we look at what local authorities have been doing with technology to enable people to connect, for example, in Hampshire, where they had 53,000 people on their shielding list, with the staff they had available to call those people and find out what they might need to support their well-being, it would have taken them 6 months to do that. And that's just not practical. So they worked with Amazon Web Service to develop an automated well-being call service, which made 2,500 calls a day to ask people how they were feeling, whether they needed support, and when they'd like a follow-up call. And those who asked for help were then put forward to a human contact centre who could then mobilise that support. So it was things they could help support people to access food parcels, prescription delivery, but also the more social things like befriending services. And Hampshire describe it as trained call advisors played the part that only a human can. They empathised, discussed options, and connected residents with support. And they used the system 4 times during all the various lockdowns and made over 185,000 calls to 70,000 people. And 4,000 of those were then passed on to that human contact centre and connected to the right sorts of support they needed at that time. And similarly, there's another system in place in Carmarthenshire where they adopted the Barcelona model of telecare. So whereas in the UK, it's very common for it to be a reactive service where you trigger an alert and a response then follows. In the Barcelona model, it's more proactive. So calls are made inbound to the home to see if that person needs any support. And before the pandemic, they were contacting 3,500 people regularly to check on their well-being and had linked them with appropriate services. And during the pandemic, this increased to 18,500. And these people were given access to a well-being worker to provide them with a personalised well-being plan. They were supported by community connectors to link them with activities, including in the third sector, and provide them with additional technology, such as bespoke tablets. And there was a platform to host online activities. So there were online day centres, online karaoke clubs, the sorts of things that people were wanting to do in person but couldn't do during the pandemic. And I think these are just good examples of technology being used to connect people and facilitate caring and sociality. But of course, we can't give technology all the credit because it's about mobilising and connecting people. And I think the importance of people in these technology systems has never been more apparent than during the pandemic. It wasn't just chatbots, it was chatbots and then a personal response that was the most appropriate thing that people were receiving. I think that's what technology is when it's at its best in care. It's not a panacea for a system that's in crisis. It's not about replacing human touch and human relationships. It's a tool, it facilitates sociality, and it can sustain and shape and maybe even in some cases create social networks and relationships, but ultimately it can never completely replace them. I think that's what I'd like to conclude on.